Welcome to Energy Insights, the podcast where we unpack the decisions, challenges, and opportunities shaping Asia's energy transition. I'm your host, Stephen. Today, we're going to Belém, Brazil, to COP30, and we're looking at it through a very specific lens: climate justice in Southeast Asia. While headlines often focus on big numbers and high level pledges, there is another layer to these talks. It's about who is most affected by the climate crisis, who gets heard in negotiations, and whether finance and energy decisions actually reach communities on the front lines. Southeast Asia as a region sits at the crossroads of rapid development, fossil fuel lock-in, and huge opportunities for a just transition. COP30 is not just another conference for this region. It is about survival, dignity, and fairness. To help us make sense of what's happening on the ground, we are joined by someone who works right at that intersection. Our guest today is Joel Chester Chan, Climate Justice Portfolio Manager at Oxfam Pilipinas. Chan is a climate justice activist, licensed environmental planner, and gender justice advocate. His work cuts across policy advocacy, community engagement, research, and communications in areas like low carbon development, just transition, and gender and development. Chen, welcome to Energy Insight.
Thank you, Stephen. And it's great to be here again. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation while COP30 is still unfolding at Belém, Brazil.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you so much, and a pleasure that you are speaking to us right from Belém, while COP30 is still in session. So before we go to understand more about these negotiations as a topic, we would like to understand, especially for our listener, about your work and your role at Oxfam, and then about this COP30. What are the agendas that you are going to attend and have been attending? Please get us through about that. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm Cheng and I work at Oxfam Pilipinas and I manage the climate justice portfolio, which means I manage the programs and campaigns, on climate justice. And we work closely with our partners and communities to ensure that, the climate policies and programs in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia really reflects the realities of those most affected by the crisis. And I'm here at COP30. I'm following the negotiations. There are side events that we organize with our partners, but I'm more closely following negotiations, engaging with our allies and civil society coalitions, and talking to the Philippine delegations and our regional counterparts and partners on trying to bring in, the stories and demands from communities back home in this global process, how that links to our work in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia to these, global platform and climate change conference. And I see my role here as helping to bridge, that gap between the high level, decision makers at the negotiations and what people are really experiencing in their daily lives, back at home and in our region in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Jen. So we've been following these websites and news on X and other websites and news about this. A lot of happening at COP30. So what is it like? Your impression on the ground, because you going around corridors, meetings, side events, a lot of things. We saw it on the calendar. What is it like? What's the mood at COP30? In your impression?
Yeah, I think when I first came at COP30, it always feels like a reunion of some sort with our allies and the people we work with, globally. But it's always almost always, there's a feeling of fatigue and urgency, in these climate negotiations. You can see that people are getting tired of there were debates, on the slow delivery and even questioning the entire COP, conference of the parties as a global platform. But really, there's a real push from vulnerable countries and communities, asking for accountability, from these platforms. And they know, that these communities are running out of time and we need to push these people who are making decisions for our future. And at COP30, maybe you've heard that it focuses on the implementation. It tries to label itself as an implementation COP or like a justice COP. And we can still see, climate finance dominating some of the conversations with, some talks on trade measures, among other things, and the delivery of the Baku to Belém roadmap, especially the need for more support on adaptation and loss and damage. And there's also clearer demand for implementation of this, because we need to move beyond commitment to actual implementation and operationalization of these promises. And being in the Amazon, Belém as at the heart of the Amazon also adds weight to everything that we feel at COP. The presence of the strong presence of indigenous peoples, and local communities that you're walking with at the hallways of the venue, it's stronger, and the message is clear, and it's shaping really the conversations at COP. And even if they're not fully heard inside the negotiations, I think these elephant in the room really pushes more these advocates like us, even the civil society, to emphasize the need for justice, to be at the foreground of this conference of the parties. And overall, it feels like COP30, we're at a crossroads, and everyone knows we can't afford another cycle of vague language, but shifting away from entrenched interests in is still a real challenge. So we need this to be highlighted in the negotiations.
Thank you, Jen, for sharing about your experience, what's happening on the ground, and then encounter with local communities. It's really interesting to hear about the message that is loud and clear. So let's bring this closer to home. So from Belém to Southeast Asia, from your perspective, this amazing event such as COP30 in a very critical moment for Southeast Asia, and is especially for a country like the Philippines. Why COP30 matters for SCA region and Philippines in particular?
Yeah. For Southeast Asia, COP30 isn't just about policies, and, isn't just about long term targets. It's also about protecting people, in the next few years. And as, branded as the Justice COP or Implementation COP, I think this branding came too late, because our region is already dealing with stronger storms, floods, heat waves, and rising sea levels. Because and in the Philippines particularly, communities barely recover from one typhoon before the next arrives. And just recently, Typhoon Kalmegi and Super Typhoon Fangwang ravaged communities, including my province. And communities and the population, especially farmers facing unpredictable seasons, and coastal areas losing land to erosion and salt water, and from sea level rise. So these are things, while we are discussing at the high level how to abate, or even how to avoid a worsening climate crisis, it's already happening. And across the ASEAN, while our energy systems differ, but our vulnerabilities are similar, if not the same. And we're highly exposed, to these climate impacts, and still dependent on imported conventional fossil fuels that are costly and unstable. Uh, and we have evidences linking that the climate crisis is caused by this industry. And what COP30 really needs to deliver on finance, adaptation, loss and damage, and fossil fuel language will determine how much space governments have to build resilient and people-centered transitions. And for the Philippines, that means ample support or appropriate support, for social protection, disaster risk reduction, just transition, not just the infrastructures, but also systems, mechanisms, institutional arrangements, that protect lives and livelihoods. So this COP really matters for the Philippines and in the Southeast Asian region. It can either unlock the resources and momentum that the region needs, or it can also worsen and leave vulnerable countries like ours to face the crisis largely on their own. So we need to deliver on justice. We need to deliver on finance. We need to deliver on things that matter for the vulnerable populations.
Mm. So, understanding these importance of COP30 to Southeast Asia and to the region, especially. So, from what you have seen so far, as in promising signs and the gaps, which part of any discussion happened at COP30 feel promising from a climate justice perspective, and do you see any gaps that should be considered?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I was following at COP is the Just Transition Work Program. And a good sign this year is that more than the 130 plus countries, included in G77 plus China, are finally talking about justice, through an institutional mechanism that we want to be established, for the Just Transition Work Program. And we're not just talking, emissions at COP now. Terms like just transition, human rights, loss and damage, locally led adaptation are showing up, more often. And these are also a reflection, of years of work by movements, pushing these ideas, pushing all these language in the decision text, forward. And there's also strong attention on adaptation, loss and damage. I'm not sure if you've heard, but there's a push, to tripling the doubling of adaptation finance. I'm not sure if that makes sense for you, but it just means we need to ramp up our adaptation financing and our commitments to adaptation. And on loss and damage, there's a strong call on filling the fund, on uh, thinking about resource mobilization. How do we now include a pot of money, a huge chunk of money to operationalize and sustain, the fund for responding to loss and damage, and which are all essential, for countries like the Philippines, and in Southeast Asia already facing the severe impacts, and some efforts, to make finance more accessible and more predictable. But there are still gaps. It's big, and much of the finance on the table remains loan based. It's adding to debt burdens, and some pledges are essentially repackaged commitment rather than new support. And that also reflects from Oxfam's new climate finance shadow report, assessing, evaluating the climate finance that countries are reporting to as part of their commitment. So there's this assessment by Oxfam. And on the energy side, you still see hesitation around the language of full fossil fuel phase out, and gas being reframed either as a long-term solution or as a transition fuel, in some proposals. And we can see these prominent push, from different negotiating blocks. And these things, no risks locking countries into new fossil infrastructure, repackaged as a natural gas or something, but it's essentially fossil fuel. And from a justice lens, that's deeply worrying because it shifts the risk onto communities while benefits go to fossil fuel companies. So these are, I'd like to say, the the winners, remain as winners, and it's the same, losers from the traditional energy systems that lose, in the game of energy transition.
So we can see that there's a role for a negotiator. So when we're talking about this negotiator and civil society, especially if when you encounter them from Southeast Asia, What priorities are coming through, mostly happening strongly at COP30?
Yeah, I think for the work stream that I was following, which is the just transition work program. It's really there's really a strong momentum or push from G77 plus China, which includes almost all of the Southeast Asian countries, to establish a mechanism, an institutional arrangement that moves beyond mere dialogues and learning sessions to actually implementing a just transition plan, for countries. And we can see, from governments and even and for civil society, that on climate finance, it has to be reliable, adequate, easier to access. And because without, these resources, it's impossible to scale adaptation or even plan a just transition. So there's also a push for including a just transition as a possible just transition as a financeable activity, either from the adaptation or mitigation, funds that are available. And another priority is ensuring that global decisions reflect the region's real vulnerabilities, from stronger cyclones or typhoons to sea level rise, drought, and impacts on food systems and fisheries. Countries want, these realities built into how finance and support are structured. And we don't need the global north just to tell us, what we can do, from the money. It has to come from us. The valuation of how much losses and damages have already been incurred by these countries will also come from the global south countries, including, in Southeast Asia. And civil society is also challenging the narrative, that the new fossil fuel projects are necessary for energy security. There's this push, from several negotiating blocks, for a very averse to the language of fossil fuel phase out, and even promoting new fossil fuel projects. And then we're making the case, that renewables, storage and its efficiency and better governance offer more resilient pathways. And finally, there's also growing emphasis of participation. As I've mentioned, this is also the Justice COP. And people are asking, who gets a seat at the table: indigenous communities, women's groups, youth, workers. And because justice, isn't only about money that these rich countries have to deliver, but it's also about making decision making more democratic and inclusive. And as I've mentioned, there's a push, for the Just Transition Work Program to institutionalize participation, institutionalize social dialogue, that puts us, civil societies, communities impacted by the climate crisis, to have a seat at the table.
Thank you, Chen. So let's zooming to Philippines if we focus. So what would you say are the most important outcomes that Philippines needs from COP30?
Yeah, I think from the Philippines standpoint, we need three things from COP30. First, we need climate finance, that doesn't deepen inequality, and climate finance that is anchored on the concept of reparations, and not aid. This also means, that we need more grants, fewer and more concessional loans, and support that actually, reaches the communities or have direct access, to these climate finances to build climate resilient agriculture, strengthen, coastal protection, establishing social safety nets, and supporting, or rebuilding in ways that reduce future risks. And second, we need loss and damage systems that work in real life, not just on paper. We've seen at the very first day of COP, the the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage launched its startup phase, which means, that the loss and damage fund will now be operationalized in 2026, and countries will now be asked, to submit proposals to access the fund. And so we while they're also negotiating on some of the items, to fully operationalize that call for proposal, Filipinos are already paying the price of this crisis. So funds, while we welcome, the this launch of the startup phase, it needs to move quickly and fairly to affected communities, not to get stuck, in bureaucratic channels. And we're also seeing that in negotiations, as if we haven't, provided them enough evidences, that this has to be implemented now and this has to reach communities directly. And third, I think we need, clear global signals on moving away from fossil fuels, including gas. And if COP30 affirms, that the future is renewable, equitable, and people-centered, it strengthens the case of shifting our energy plans, at home, our communities, and even domestically. And these kinds of outcomes would genuinely shape, I believe, not only the Philippines' path over the next decade, but also of Southeast Asia.
So, Cheng, COP30 is almost wrapping up, and negotiations moving on their final phase, right? So, what would be the important agenda that you will be watching in the final days of COP30 closely?
Yeah, as I've mentioned earlier, I'm mainly following the Just Transition work program, but including that, I'm watching four things closely. So I'll start with the Just Transition work program. So I'm working closely to lobby for an institutional arrangement along with our allies and even other Oxfam colleagues, all over the country, all over the world, that we need to establish this institutional mechanism for move beyond talk shops, to move beyond sharing of knowledge and high level dialogues, because I think we've established enough, that just transition means leaving no one behind, and just transition means we have to have a seat at the table, and along the process, of transitioning to low carbon society or a net zero economy, people, communities, impacted by the climate crisis, has to be part of that process. And what better way to do that at the global space is an institutional arrangement that enables, participation, inclusion, in these conversations. And we'd like to call it the Belém Action Mechanism, or BAM. Most of the negotiators, belonging to the G77 plus China bloc is supportive, of that mechanism, and we're happy, on that note. Second, I think also not just limited to the Just Transition work program, but across all negotiating stream, we're also following the language on fossil fuel, because whether the final text calls for a full phase out, a partial one, or uses vague wording, will signal, how serious our governments, or not even our government, and other governments and investors are moving, beyond coal, oil, and gas. And we are also seeing, some push and pull from developing countries, from developed countries, on this word. But if we remember COP28 decision on the global stock take, there's already an acknowledgement that we need to transition away from fossil fuel. So it has to be respected, that decision, moving forward, And the third is the new climate finance goal. Last COP29, we see the new collective quantified goal, or NCQG, which is basically our new climate finance goal. So the Baku to Belém roadmap that is being discussed right now, it has to be operationalized. It has to be decided on, on the commitments. And it's not just the number that we need to look at, but whether it also reflects, the real needs of vulnerable countries. The balance, between grants and loans will show if it's genuinely supported or just politically convenient. And we also need to look at how to increase those commitments, from the 300 billion initial, initial or startup, I would say, um, from the 300 billion decision from last COP, it has to be more ambitious, and we need to think of how to mobilize 1.3 trillion US dollars per year to support adaptation, loss and damage, and mitigation actions. And lastly, the operational details for loss and damage and adaptation. This is related to the climate finance goal, but for adaptation, there's also an ongoing negotiations on the global goal on adaptation. And these are sets of indicators, that will be the basis, for saying that we are adaptive or not. And we've heard, promises here and there for years. But what matters now is whether support, actually reaches the communities. And questions like direct access, safeguards, transparency, accountability, will determine if COP30 really delivers substance or just, another set of headlines.
So, Chad, as you closely follow these four important agendas, and then you've seen the gaps and the and progress and whatnot. So, moving forward, how will you measure or judge personally whether these topics being discussed moving forward at COP30? Personally, how would you measure whether it was a success or not?
Yeah. For me, maybe, success isn't just about what the final decision text says, but, outside the UNFCCC processes, whether it actually moves us closer to justice, and if it beyond the negotiations, the decisions are actually moving or actually operationalizing. And I'll be asking whether there were stronger finance commitments rooted in responsibility, whether there were real movements on phasing out fossil fuels in a way that it protects workers and communities, and whether support systems for loss and damage became more accessible and effective. And if the answers are mostly yes, then COP30 delivered progress, even if imperfect. But if not, we need to acknowledge that it fell short, for the people and who need action the most. And either way, COP30 is just one step in a much longer fight for climate and energy justice. And after this, our job is to hold governments and institutions and other, duty bearers accountable for what they have already promised, in these negotiations or even outside negotiations, and what they also didn't promise. So I think those are some things, that I would say would decide if it's a success or not.
So these promises, I'm sure, comes with the hopes. So we'll talk about there's been some delays and so some setbacks. However, we can see the progress going forward. So just want to wrap up this on a more of your personal note for our listener. Despite all of these, still progressing. It's a process to come, and it needs a lot of efforts to emphasize going forward. What would you hope, and then what gives you uh, belief that it will sustain and it is feasible?
Yeah, I think cops are, as I've mentioned, it's also like a reunion of some sort for the movements, allies, and partners that we have. But what gives me more hope, is that people aren't waiting, for permission to act. While these conversations are happening
Mhm.
at COP, across the Philippines and in Southeast Asia and even other developing countries, communities are already creating solutions. And governments need to acknowledge that, that the solutions are not waiting after negotiations are decided or after there are decisions, made from COPs. And, from community run renewable energy to early warning systems and adaptation plans, led by women and indigenous groups. these are already happening, and we're not waiting, from those uh, uh, high level decision makers, to for us to do to adapt to mitigate the impacts of climate crisis. And I also see, hope in how the climate justice movement is evolving, is growing, and it became more inclusive, more intersectional, more connected, across borders, and we can see solidarity from different groups. While we have our own agenda, there's solidarity, to deliver on justice, to deliver on accountability, to deliver on our commitment to climate justice. Youth, farmers, workers, LGBTQ advocates, so many groups are now pushing together to for real, structural change, uh, even, beyond conference of the parties. Inside, a COP venue, progress can feel slow. It has been, felt by the civil society for quite some time. But when you look, at what people, our allies, our partners are doing on the ground, you see courage, you see creativity, you see solidarity. And that's what keeps us going, as climate justice advocates, as activists. And that's what also convinces me that real change is still possible as long as I have my colleagues, as long as I have our allies, our partners, pushing for justice, pushing for change. Real change is possible and it's reachable.
Chen, thank you very much, bringing COP30 down to earth and reminding us that every negotiations are real communities, real risks, and real opportunities for a fairer future. To our listener, as we have encountered from Chen, the discussions, the progress, and all the gaps and the hopes, every decision made in Belém will shape how countries like the Philippines and its neighboring countries navigating the next decade of climate impacts and energy choices. Whether COP30 delivers or disappoints, the work of climate and energy justice will continue long after the final plenary. Thank you for tuning in today's episode of Energy Insights. If you find this conversation helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest in Asia energy transition. For more analysis and stories, visit our website at energytracker.asia. I'm Stephen, and I see you next time on Energy Insights. Thank you, Chang.